It was one of those nights when the air feels thick, like something was pushing down on your shoulders. The sky was heavy with clouds that seemed to swallow up the stars, leaving the town in a darkness that felt more like a warning than a lack of light. You could feel it in the pit of your stomach, that queasy sensation that tells you something bad is about to happen. And once it starts, you won't be able to stop it. It wasn't supposed to be a big deal, just a little Halloween fun. Everyone knew the stories about the old cemetery, how it had a reputation for being haunted, how some folks in town claimed they saw strange lights flickering behind the iron gates every Halloween night. But that's all it was, right? Stories. Just tales to keep kids from messing around in the graveyard after dark. But then we crossed through those gates. The hinges groaned like something alive. Like the gate didn't want to let us in, or, worse, didn't want to let us leave. A gust of wind followed us, kicking up dead leaves that seemed to chase us along the path. I remember thinking how quiet it was. No birds, no crickets. Just silence, thick as the shadows that clung to the tombstones. The others laughed it off at first, cracking jokes, pretending they weren't scared. But it didn't take long for the mood to change. The further we walked, the colder it got. Not a natural cold. This was different, like the warmth of life was being sucked away from us, drawn into the earth, into the graves below. And that's when we saw her. She was standing near the back, just beyond the tree line, where the oldest graves were. Her dress was pale, almost glowing, and her hair hung in long, tangled strands down her back. From where we stood, we couldn't see her face, but we could feel her watching us, even though her head never moved. "Who the hell is that?" one of the guys whispered, his voice low, as if he didn't want her to hear him. No one answered. We didn't know. We didn't want to know. But we should have turned back right then. We should have run. Instead, we moved closer. The wind picked up again, colder this time, biting at our skin. I felt my heart pound in my chest, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I don't know why, but I was the one who spoke. I called out to her. "Hey, you okay?" My voice was stronger than I expected. Brave. Stupid. She didn't answer. She didn't move. It was like she didn't even hear me. And then, all at once, the lights went out. The lanterns we'd brought, dead. The flashlights, flickered, then snuffed out like someone had pinched them off. We were plunged into complete darkness. For a moment, no one spoke. No one breathed. We were surrounded by the blackness, so thick it felt like it was crawling over us, pressing in, choking us. And then, God help me, I heard it. A whisper. No, not a whisper. A breath. Close. Too close. I spun around, my eyes darting through the dark, but I couldn't see anything. I couldn't even see the others. Just the vague shapes of the tombstones all around us. I reached out, desperate to grab hold of someone. Anyone. But there was nothing. My hand passed through the air like it was water, thick and empty. I was alone. That's when the laughter started. It wasn't the others. I know that because the laughter. It wasn't human. It was broken, jagged, like the sound of a child's toy running out of batteries, slow and distorted. It echoed around the cemetery, bouncing off the graves, growing louder, more twisted, more wrong. And then, in the briefest flash of moonlight, I saw her face. Not the girl in white. No, this was something else. Something older. Something dead. She was grinning, her teeth black and sharp. Her eyes empty hollows that stared into me, through me. Her skin hung in ragged strips from her face, peeling back like old wallpaper, revealing the rotting skull beneath. Her breath was cold, colder than anything I've ever felt, and it smelled of damp earth and decay. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. Suddenly, the lights flickered back on, the others standing only a few feet from me, oblivious to what had just happened. They hadn't seen it. They didn't know. But I knew, and she was still there, waiting in the shadows, watching. Her hollow eyes fixed on me. We weren't alone in that cemetery. We never had been. We'd broken something, awakened something, and now it was coming for us. Somewhere in the distance I heard a low rumble. Thunder, maybe. Or maybe something else. Something worse. The first jump scare wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. When the lights flickered back on, I could still feel her eyes on me, even though I couldn't see her. My breath came in short gasps, and I tried to shake the image of that face, rotting, grinning, a dead thing that had no right to exist. But the others didn't notice. They didn't know. "Just a power glitch," someone said, forcing a laugh, but their voice wavered. We all knew something was wrong. The wind had died down, but the cold hadn't. It clung to us like a second skin. And that laughter, it was still echoing in my head like a bad memory I couldn't shake. We walked deeper into the cemetery, past rows of crumbling headstones and marble angels with cracked faces. The ground felt uneven beneath my feet, soft in some places like it could give way at any moment. The farther we went, the less familiar the surroundings became. It was as if the cemetery was shifting, growing. Paths that had seemed clear before were now swallowed by overgrowth. The trees seemed closer. their branches stretching out like skeletal hands, blocking out what little light the moon offered. One of the girls stopped, her face pale. "We shouldn't be here," she whispered. "It feels wrong." She was right. Everything about this place was wrong. The silence wasn't just the absence of sound. It was oppressive, like the earth itself was holding its breath, waiting, watching. But none of us wanted to be the one to back down. Not yet. Not when we had something to prove. "Look," one of the others said, pointing ahead. "That's it. That's the mausoleum." There, looming in the distance, was the old stone building. It looked ancient, its roof half collapsed and ivy crawling over its walls like it was trying to swallow it whole. The door was hanging off its hinges, creaking softly in the breeze. No one had been inside that mausoleum for decades, or at least that's what we'd been told. We approached it slowly, the crunch of dead leaves underfoot the only sound breaking the silence. The closer we got, the stronger the smell became. Rot. Decay. Like something long dead. Something that had been buried too deep to be forgotten. "Maybe we should just go," someone muttered. But it was too late. We were already there. I reached for the door, and the instant my fingers touched the cold metal, a rush of air hit me, cold and wet, like the breath of something waiting inside. The door groaned as it swung open, revealing the yawning darkness within. No one moved, no one spoke. And then we heard it, a faint scratching sound, from deep inside the mausoleum. Scraping like nails on stone, getting louder, more frantic. Something was in there. Something alive. Or something that had once been alive. "We're not going in there, are we?" someone whispered. But before anyone could answer, the scratching stopped. The silence that followed was thick, oppressive. Then suddenly, crack! The ground beneath us shifted, and with a sickening lurch, the earth gave way. I barely had time to shout before we were falling, tumbling down into the darkness below. The ground swallowed us whole, and everything went black. When I opened my eyes, I was alone. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to make sense of what had happened. I was lying on cold, damp earth, surrounded by what felt like walls of dirt. The faint smell of rot was stronger now, almost suffocating. I scrambled to my feet, trying to find my bearings, but it was too dark, too quiet, and then I saw them. The graves, unmarked, shallow, their dirt freshly turned. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what I was standing in, an underground tomb, or something worse. There were bones scattered around, some of them old and brittle, others disturbingly fresh. I could feel the weight of death all around me, pressing down from the soil above. I turned, looking for the others, but there was no sign of them. Only shadows, only graves. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A figure, half hidden in the darkness, crawling out of one of the unmarked graves. Its limbs were twisted, its skin pale and shriveled. It dragged itself toward me with agonizing slowness, its mouth open in a silent scream, its eyes hollow sockets. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled backward, my foot catching on something hard. I looked down and my stomach turned. A hand, cold, skeletal, was reaching out of the earth, grasping at my ankle. I kicked it away, my heart racing, but more hands were emerging now, clawing their way out of the dirt. Bodies were pulling themselves free, their mouths gaping open, their fingers reaching for me. And then, I heard it again. That laughter. That broken, inhuman laughter, echoing from somewhere deeper in the earth. It was coming for us. I turned to run, but before I could take a step, a cold, bony hand wrapped around my wrist, pulling me back. I fell, crashing to the ground, my head slamming into something hard. Pain shot through me, and for a moment everything went white. When my vision cleared, I saw her, the girl in white. She was standing over me, her eyes empty, her mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. Her face was rotting now, the flesh peeling away to reveal the skull beneath. She leaned down, her cold breath washing over me, and whispered, "You shouldn't have come here." Then, with a sickening crack, the earth swallowed me whole. As the darkness closed in, the last thing I heard was the sound of the graves opening, one by one, and the laughter. Always the laughter, but this time it sounded closer. Too close! I didn't expect to wake up, but I did. My eyes snapped open, and for a moment, I thought I was still in the dark, buried under the earth, suffocating. My body ached, my head throbbed, and there was that same stench of decay, thick and choking. But I wasn't underground anymore, at least not fully. The mausoleum loomed above me, its cracked stone ceiling was just visible in the dim light. I was lying on the cold, hard ground, the air thick with dust and rot. For a moment I just lay there, blinking, trying to piece together what had happened. The others, where were they? Had they made it out? Or were they... A low groan echoed from somewhere deep within the mausoleum, dragging me out of my thoughts. I froze, straining to hear. It sounded human, but barely. Weak. Broken. Like someone trying to scream but unable to make the words come. I forced myself to stand, every muscle in my body screaming in protest. The floor beneath me was littered with debris. Pieces of broken stone, old bones, and something wet that I didn't want to think too hard about. My heart raced, every beat pounding in my ears, but I couldn't stay here. I couldn't. The groan came again, louder this time, closer. My breath caught in my throat as I looked around. The mausoleum stretched out in front of me, deeper than it should have been. The walls seemed to twist, the shadows warping into shapes that shouldn't exist. The tombstones outside had been old, weathered, but inside the crypts were worse. The names on the plaques had long since faded, eroded by time, but I could feel the presence of the dead. They were watching, waiting. Then I saw movement. At the far end of the mausoleum, just past a row of crumbling stone coffins, a figure stood. At first I thought it was one of the others, but as I squinted I realized how wrong I was. It wasn't moving like a person. Its arms hung limply at its sides, its head lolling to one side like a puppet on broken strings. The light was dim, but I could see enough. Too much. The figure wasn't human. Not anymore. Its skin, what was left of it, was pale and waxy, pulled tight over bones that jutted out unnaturally. Its eyes, black pits, stared straight ahead, unblinking, empty, and its mouth, a gaping, bloody hole, hung open, as if frozen in the middle of a scream. My legs felt like lead, but I forced myself to move, slowly, quietly, trying to stay out of its sight. But I wasn't fast enough. The thing's head snapped toward me with a sickening crack, its hollow eyes locking onto mine. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. It didn't move at first, just stared, unblinking, its head twitching slightly, as if it was trying to remember how to work its body. And then it screamed. The sound ripped through the mausoleum, a guttural, blood-curdling wail that echoed off the walls. It wasn't human. It was something else, something ancient, something that had no place in the world of the living. And then it began to move. It didn't walk. It jerked forward, its limbs snapping unnaturally as it dragged itself toward me, faster than I could have imagined. I turned and ran, my feet slipping on the wet stone as I bolted for the entrance. The thing's scream followed me, rising in pitch, inhuman, filled with a rage so pure it froze the blood in my veins. I reached the door, slamming into it with all my weight, and for a terrifying second it didn't budge. But then, with a groan, it creaked open, and I stumbled out into the cold night air, gasping for breath. But I wasn't safe. The cemetery was different now. The gravestones that had once been scattered haphazardly across the ground were now perfectly aligned, like soldiers standing at attention. And the air, it was thick with the smell of death. The wind was gone, the trees still, but there was something else. A presence. I could feel it. The dead were awake now. All of them. A shadow moved to my left, and I spun around, expecting to see another of those things, but it was worse. The others, my friends, were there. But they weren't moving. They were standing still, their faces pale, their eyes wide and blank. It was like they were frozen in place, held by some invisible force. I called out to them, my voice hoarse, but they didn't respond. They just stared straight ahead, unblinking. And then, one by one, they turned their heads toward me, slowly, mechanically, like marionettes on strings. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't right. This wasn't them. It couldn't be. You shouldn't have come here. A voice whispered, low and cold, from somewhere behind me. I spun around, and there she was, the girl in white. Her eyes were different now, dark, empty, like twin black holes pulling me in. Her face had decayed further, the flesh hanging loosely from her skull, but there was something even more terrifying about her now. She smiled, a slow, rotting smile. You woke them up, she said, her voice a soft hiss, like the wind through dead leaves. Now they want what's theirs. I tried to speak, tried to ask what she meant, but the words wouldn't come. My throat was dry, my legs trembling beneath me. They were buried here for a reason, she continued, stepping closer. And now that they're awake, they won't rest. Not until they take what they've been waiting for. Her hand reached out, long, thin fingers brushing against my arm. Her touch was ice, colder than anything I'd ever felt. And then from behind her I saw them. The dead, crawling from their graves, their eyes locked on us. On me. You shouldn't have come here, she whispered again, her voice echoing in my ears. And then, in a voice that didn't belong to her, in a voice that sounded like 1,000 others, she said the words that sent chills down my spine, words that would haunt me long after this night. You're already one of us. The ground beneath my feet trembled, the air around me growing colder, thicker. My breath came in ragged gasps as the dead closed in, their hollow eyes staring, their mouths opening wide, hungry. And then, darkness. Cold, suffocating darkness, and silence. But the last thing I felt before the world disappeared was the touch of her hand, cold as death, pulling me down. For a moment there was nothing but the blackness. The world dissolved into that cold, suffocating dark, as if I had been swallowed whole by the cemetery itself. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The grip of the dead was all around me, pulling me deeper into the void. But then, something strange happened. A soft glow pierced through the darkness, faint at first but growing stronger. It wasn't the pale, sickly light of the girl in white, or the twisted souls crawling out of their graves. This light was warm, pure. It felt like sunlight on my skin, like the warmth of life itself pushing back against the cold grip of death. The light grew, spreading through the cemetery, chasing away the shadows, the twisted spirits, and the hollow eyes that had surrounded me. I felt the weight on my chest lift, the cold fingers of the dead releasing me, and for the first time that night I could breathe again. I opened my eyes, blinking against the light, and there, standing at the edge of the cemetery, was an old man. He was tall, with silver hair and deep lines carved into his face, but his eyes were bright, clear, and full of something I hadn't felt since stepping foot in the cemetery. Hope. He raised a hand, his voice calm but strong, cutting through the last of the shadows. "It's over now. You're safe." I staggered back, still gasping for air, but the grip of fear was loosening. The girl in white was gone. The dead were retreating, sinking back into their graves, their hollow eyes dimming as the light washed over them. The cemetery that had seemed so twisted and wrong now looked peaceful. Still, the old man approached, his steps steady, the warmth of the light surrounding him. "This place, it was cursed long ago," he said, his voice gentle. "But curses can be broken." I glanced around, half expecting the ground to shift beneath me, for the dead to rise once more. But everything was still, calm. Even the air was warmer, the chill that had clung to me all night dissipating. Who are you?" I managed to ask, my voice shaking. He smiled softly, and there was something kind in his eyes. "A guardian of sorts. This town, this cemetery, it's seen a lot of pain. But the dead don't need vengeance. They need rest. And you?" He pointed at me, his smile fading slightly. "You gave them that chance." I didn't do anything," I stammered, still struggling to make sense of what had just happened. The girl in white, the dead, the cold grip of the earth, all of it had felt so real. "So final. You came," the old man said simply. "You didn't run. You faced them, and in doing so, you reminded them of what they had lost. Their anger." He waved a hand toward the graves. "It wasn't about you. It was about the life they could no longer have. You were the bridge." The warmth of the light wrapped around me like a comforting blanket. The terror I'd felt began to melt away, replaced by something new, something lighter. Hope. I turned toward the others. They were all standing there, dazed but alive, no longer frozen, no longer trapped. The old man looked at them, his expression softening. "They will be all right. The dead have released them. It's over." I took a deep breath, feeling the last traces of fear leave my body. "And the girl in white?" He looked out toward the graves, his eyes distant, as though he were seeing something beyond what I could. "She's found peace too. You helped her remember who she was before the curse took hold. She was just a child once, lost, afraid, and now, she's free." As the last of the darkness faded from the cemetery, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders, as though the ground itself had been holding me down. I couldn't explain it, couldn't fully understand what had happened that night, but I knew one thing for sure. The curse was broken. The old man gave me a final nod, a twinkle in his eye, and began to walk away, his figure slowly dissolving into the warm light that filled the cemetery. I wanted to call out to him, ask more questions, but something told me that he had already given me all the answers I needed. The sun was beginning to rise now, soft rays of pink and gold spilling over the horizon. The town below was quiet, peaceful, as if the darkness of the night had been nothing more than a bad dream. I stood at the cemetery gate, my heart still pounding, but in a different way now. I wasn't afraid, not anymore. I turned back toward the graves one last time, and as I did, I saw it. The faint outline of the girl in white, standing near the tree line. But this time she wasn't decayed. She wasn't twisted and grotesque. She was whole, her face serene, her eyes soft. She gave me a small smile, a sad one but full of gratitude. Then she faded, disappearing into the morning light. The others joined me, their faces pale but relieved. No one spoke for a long moment, the weight of the night hanging between us. Finally, one of them whispered, "Let's go home," and we did. The ghosts of All Hallows Eve had found their rest, and so had we.